Good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic to see. Yep, can you hear me all right? Apparently we're being live streamed as well, so need to make sure the audio is working well. Welcome to this session at the end of the first day of the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Like me, you're probably feeling slightly tired at this point, especially if you started the festivities last night. So we hope to have a lively session here now. We've got 4 great speakers. And one of the things I'm hoping to do in this session is have a little bit of discussion, potentially even disagreement. I'm aware that the Oxford Real Farming Conference is a great place to meet friends and talk about what we agree on. But I think it's also quite important to surface some of the tricky stuff as well. So I've assembled 4 speakers with different perspectives on the future of food, farming, nature and climate. And so in a respectful environment, I'm hoping we'll have a good degree of different views with the aim basically of coming together at the end and saying, do we have enough common ground here so that we can really start to progress the agenda? I'm taking as read that we are all largely agreed about the long-term direction we want to go in, but there's a lot of questions about the routes to get there. So I'm Gareth Morgan, and I work in the policy team at the Soil Association. And I'll introduce my 4 co-panelists first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the session that we're going to do. So perhaps you just briefly, first of all, like to introduce yourself, starting with Dustin.
Hello, I'm Dustin Benton. I'm Policy Director at Green Alliance. I have a background in energy, actually, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about climate. But I have come to land and nature because, my goodness, we need really rapid action to restore nature and to use the land as a carbon sink. But I'm not going to give my talk, so I'm just going to hand over at that point. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Katie Jo Laxton. I'm the Global Conservation Director for the RSPB. I grew up on farms in Gloucestershire and the Welsh borders, and my father was part of the early organic movement, so I've been sort of privileged to be through this change my whole life and be part of it now.
Hi everyone, my name's Helen Keyes. I'm a farmer from County Tyrone. Small farm, just 50 acres. This is my first ORFC, so be kind. I am Vice Chair in Northern Ireland of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. I'm also involved with a project called the Growing Innovation Network, which is creating conversations between farmers about the sort of change that we need to make. I do some work at Caffrey, where we run an innovation competition in the local Agri-Food College. I'm the founder of Source Grow, which is a business where we link local farms and growers with chefs. And I'm the entrepreneur in residence at Queen's University.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Adele Jones, Executive Director of the Sustainable Food Trust. I'm sure most of you here probably know who we are, but just in case, we're a small-ish UK-based non-profit working globally to accelerate the transition to more sustainable, regenerative, agroecological, choose your term, food systems. Organic, of course, Christopher, yeah, don't forget that. Biodynamic, nature-friendly, climate-smart. And I've been with the Sustainable Food Trust now for just over 10 years, having also spent a little bit of time during that 10 years in DEFRA and also the Welsh Government.
Great, thank you very much. The format of the day is I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce a perspective on the topic with introduce themselves on the topic with about 5 or 10 minutes. Then I'll ask them an initial leading question, and then we're going to open the questions to the floor here. And we're also being live streamed, so we're hoping questions will be coming through online as well, which we aim to get around to. We've got about 90 minutes, and I will make sure we finish on time, because I'm sure everybody is both tired and keen to get off to the pub this evening. So we won't hold you here beyond 5:30, but I'm sure the panelists will be happy to stay and chat if you'd like to do so. So just a little bit of scene setting to start. First of all, the journey we're on to agroecology, and I always frame this in terms of, and I guess I would say this coming from the Soil Association, that in 10 or 15 years' time, the food and farming system is going to look a lot like organic, even if it's not all called organic. So there are various things that are going to have to change very rapidly in the food and farming system if we're going to reach what looks like a sustainable system. And there are some key things I think that would need to be at the heart of that. One is the recognition that fundamentally farming is a natural process, ecological process, where nature is at the heart of the farming system. Secondly, that there's a vital ongoing role for farmers to be producing safe, healthy, nourishing food. And although there may be new kids on the block, new ways of producing food, that producing food from land and soil-based agriculture is going to remain completely fundamental to that. And thirdly, that diversity needs to be brought into the heart of the food and farming system. Interesting, of course, that the Oxford Farming Conference this week has taken diversity as its theme, probably a theme it wouldn't have embraced 10 years ago. So it's perhaps a sign of how far things and how fast things are changing. At the centre of the sort of arguments raging about the food and farming system is a historic perception that nature and farming are somehow oppositional. And in recent years, the advent of the nature-friendly farming network, I think, has clearly demonstrated that there's both an appetite amongst the farming community and amongst environmentalists that needs to be put to bed and changed. Having said that, there's a huge gulf at the moment between where we are and where we need to be. Just coming here on the train from the West Country to this conference, looking out at the flooded fields, which seem to be the clearest sign that climate change is here, happening and now. The flooded fields of North Wiltshire, which I knew 20 years ago as pasture, which are now huge fields of maize, which have just been harvested, flooded fields, and I live downstream the River Avon, which is currently a moving river of silt, taking all that soil out to sea. So there's a huge changes taking place, which are currently going in the wrong direction. Other examples that we've seen in the last a few years, the River Wye, which has turned from a pristine salmon and trout river to a vector that's taking chicken slurry to the sea. Loch Ness in Northern Ireland, which 10 years ago was one of the best water bodies in Europe, which now seems to be so eutrophic it can't support any life. So there's this gulf between where we know we need to get to with the food and farming system and what's actually happening. And although there are some good things going on, and the countries around the UK are now developing much more progressive farming systems. We had an announcement this morning from the Secretary of State for Westminster about England farming policy, which moved things on again. But there still seems to be this gap between where we need to get to and where we are. And one of the things I'm keen to do is to encourage us who have a common view about where we need to get to have some robust conversations about how we create enough of a movement and a coalition of interests that make that unstoppable and surface some of the difficult things we need to talk about. So the perspectives we've got today include a view perhaps more influenced by what needs to happen in the food and farming system for climate, what needs to happen for nature, what needs to happen for farm businesses, and what needs to happen in the food system. So we've got some different perspectives, and I'm hoping that that will enable us to explore some of these issues and where some of the tensions lie, where perhaps we're going to need to make compromises if we're going to create that coalition of interests that make the change itself unstoppable. So with that little bit of background, I think I will introduce our panelists to introduce their perspective on the topic. Then we'll move over to opportunity to ask questions and explore some of these issues and tensions. So Dustin, I'll ask you to kick off, and I think you've got a few slides, so let's hope they're working.
Thank you. I have brought some slides because I'm going to talk about numbers because I'm talking about climate, and talking about numbers without pictures is really boring and it's 10 past 4, so hopefully the pictures will be interesting enough to keep your attention. I come to this from, so I work for a think tank. We're trying to work out how we decarbonize the land system, how we create space for nature, and how we create good food. This basically is the summary of what I think we all want from our land. We definitely want food, we definitely want culture, we definitely want viable rural economies, but we're adding these new things to what we want. And one of the thing I will talk most about today is carbon removal. It's a new agenda for farming. It's something that when I was working for DEFRA, I think was a slightly alien or perhaps slightly uncomfortable conversation. And I'm raising it here because I haven't heard enough, I think, over the course of the day and in my conversations with agroecologists about what agroecology can do for climate. And we have a mandate to have difficult conversations, so I hope I'm going to lean in and start to have some of that difficult conversation. I guess, yeah, I'm going to start with a bit of difficulty here. Where are we in the economy? So this top bar here, the grey bar, is the economy's emissions as a whole. It's indexed to 100%. So what you've seen is emissions have fallen by about a third across the whole of the UK economy. This is a really good news story. For a rich country, we're doing a pretty darn good job of decarbonising. The next two bars are just the food system. So the bits which you will engage with as a consumer, you know, when you go and cook something or if you get a takeaway or something like that. But the thing to pay attention to is that big blue blob, which is agriculture. And the difference between 2018, the last bit of data I had for this slide, and 2008, when the Climate Act came in, is nothing at all. So we passed a Climate Act in the UK, we said we were going to decarbonise, and agriculture has not decarbonised at all. I want to make sure I wasn't telling you a false story based on the new data. It hasn't changed materially. Agriculture is not decarbonising, and it's a real problem. What is decarbonising is the other bits of the system, so the lorry that gets the food from the farm to the shop or whatever, and that's changing due to spillovers from renewable energy, from better, more efficient refrigeration, from lower carbon vehicles, all that kind of stuff. And that's going to continue. But agriculture has a climate problem. Where's this coming from? I wanted to dig into this because when I talk to people, I think people assume that for agriculture, climate change is a fossil fuel problem. And for the economy as a whole, be in no doubt, fossil fuels are the problem. We need to get to zero fossil fuels. But for agriculture, things are a bit different. Actually, fossil fuels are only about 10% of agriculture's climate problem. That's like things like the fuel in the tractor, or maybe the diesel that goes into, or the gas that goes into the heating if you're pasteurizing milk or something like that. That's the smallest fraction. The next biggest is, in my characterization here, is soils. And here is an area where agroecology has a really good and interesting set of solutions. Using land in ways that doesn't require so much fertilizer, which is a big source of soil emissions, keeping the soil in a good, healthy state. These are all kind of climate solutions within the agroecology sort of space, but not uncontested by conventional agriculture. But the elephant in the room, or rather the cow in the room, if I'm going to put my finger on it, is animal agriculture. It's methane. So that's mostly, that bottom thing is mostly burping, and then manure, which is mostly from cattle, but also comes, sheep, pigs, chicken, etc. These are the big sources of emissions in the farming system, and they are the things that are really tricky and difficult to tackle. And the uncomfortable truth for agroecology is that although I don't want this, I want to be really clear, this is not my proposition. If I was just targeting carbon, and I wanted to make, for example, cows or chickens or what have you in the most carbon efficient way possible, I'd grow them quick and I'd kill them young, because that's the way that you get them to burp less and they produce less methane. That is entirely at odds with the agroecological ethic, and I think that's a good ethic. So I pose this as a problem because what agroecology stands for, good quality lives for animals, animals that can live and enjoy their life, that is something that is slightly in tension with the kind of productivist, pile them high, sell them cheap, grow the cows quickly, kill them young kind of mode. But agroecology, I think, has a good story in here as well. And that's because when I speak to agroecologists, what I hear is an ethic of sufficiency. I hear we don't need cheap burgers every day. We should be eating what the land provides, and that means less. Not none, but less. And that, I think, is really crucial to agroecology's story about how it adds up to a net zero food system. And I should say that agroecology and food is not just about what we produce, it's about how we use land. Because by 2050, we're going to have cows, we're going to have chickens, we're going to have pigs, etc. And they're going to keep emitting. And that means that these residual emissions in the system need to be offset by negative emissions, by net sequestration. Most of that sequestration, as you can see from this chart, this is from the Committee on Climate Change, as are most of my bits of data, is from the land system itself. So it's the animals that we will want as part of our food system. We're going to need to sequester carbon in order to offset that. Where does that come from? We're getting even dorkier as I go on, but don't worry, I'm going to come back out of dorky mode. You'll be pleased to hear. That comes mainly from semi-natural habitats. So what you can see on the left-hand side, and this is another uncomfortable trade-off, which I feel I've got to surface so we can have an honest conversation, is that land that grows food tends to release carbon, whereas land that doesn't grow food tends to sequester carbon. Organic farmland, where we've got data, is better than conventional agriculture. It produces less emissions per unit area. That's a good thing. But if we're going to get to net zero, then we need to create space on and off farms for woodland, for scrub, for a much more diverse countryside with lots of semi-natural habitat as well as agroecological farmland. This is the result of a modeling study that we produced at the beginning of last year, actually, which describes what happens if we keep the food and land system roughly the way it is, but we try to kind of bodge it to get to net zero. So it's a kind of techno-fix, kind of don't really care about how we do agriculture and just fix it, mainly by using what's called BECCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. What you do is you harvest a lot of wood from overseas. What's happening in that yellow blob there that's going past the today line is we're harvesting lots of forests overseas, shipping them to the UK, burning them in a big power station or set of power stations, and then sticking the emissions from those under the North Sea in a big, complicated kind of technological process. What that does is to increase the amount of land that the UK depends on globally in order to feed itself and to hit net zero. It's a really silly way of doing things, and it's a really expensive way of doing things. So this is not what we want, but I think it's business as usual. And I mention this because when I think about land in a climate sense, you have to think not just about the land that's used for food, but you also think about the land that's used for climate and nature, which I'm not going to talk too much about because Katie Jo will. Hopefully we won't disagree with each other, but happy to if we do. Coming back to this point about trade-offs, this is a caricature, just to be clear. It's a sort of simplification of what is actually a spectrum, but I think a useful one. When we think about this, you have high-yielding farmland, and that tends to be conventional agriculture where you use nitrogen to maximize your yields. It's very good at producing food. You get lots of yield per hectare. It's not great for nature. You tend not to have very much nature, and it's really not good at climate. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got semi-natural habitats. They don't really produce food or not very much, but they're brilliant for nature and great for climate mitigation. And in the middle is a really important part of the picture. My argument is you need all three of these, but in a very different proportion from today. You can produce food on land with nature. Doesn't do very much for climate, but it's a really important part of a mixed system, which in our view looks like this. I'm just going to spend a minute on unpacking this chart for you, because this is what we at Green Alliance have thought about. How do we square this circle of all the things that we want from the land, respecting the fact that there are these biophysical trade-offs, and getting what we really want, which is a good diet, a climate that's stable, and a really rich, healthy natural environment. What we end up doing is having some conventional agriculture, and that's because it's very productive, and the way in which you reduce the amount of land that you need to farm intensively is by changing your diet. It's by eating less meat, simply. So in our scenario, we have halved the amount of meat, just about 45% less by 2050, because we think that's consistent with a healthy diet, and because that means you don't have to do silly things like lots of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. On the other hand, we've said we think we need more space for nature. We need more semi-natural habitats in Britain. And that might sound a bit scary to you because you might be thinking this is crazy rewilding. This guy's accent sounds like he's from North America. Yes, I'm from California. So a different kind of landscape context. But Britain has amongst the lowest level of semi-natural habitat of any country in Western Europe. We have half the level of Italy and something like 50% less than Germany or France. We are, when organizations like the RSPB say we're nature depleted, we really, really are. The great thing about that semi-natural habitat is it's brilliant at sequestering carbon. That is land that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and we think that the people who own that land ought to be paid to do that. But the biggest slab you see in the middle there, that light blue in the middle at the top there, again, this is all indexed to today, it's how farmland might change, is agroecological farmland. And that's because the type of species that Britain has tend to like a low-intensity, mixed, diverse landscape with some farming and some semi-natural habitat. If you do this system at the top, you get nearly double the amount of nature by 2050, and you get to net zero without having to rely on lots of imported bioenergy, and you have the amount of lands overseas that we are currently using to buy things like pineapples and bananas and soya and all the rest of it. And the great news is that agroecology is the big winner, and it doesn't cost the earth. We think this costs roughly what the system costs today, at least to the taxpayer in the kind of farm payment stuff. So the takeaway message here is that by mixing a big dollop of agroecology with a bunch of nature and a little bit of conventional agriculture, what you can come up with is this brilliant system that restores nature, hits our climate objectives, and doesn't cost the earth. Thank you.
Dustin, thank you. I asked you to be provocative and you've delivered, which is great. So thank you for kicking off with that. One quick question from me. I mean, I'm greedy. I want it all. So I'd like everything to be agroecological, but you've still got a big compartment or a modest compartment for intensive stroke conventional agriculture there. What does that actually look like?
It is almost certainly an evolved version of conventional agriculture today. So you will need nitrogen input for this because you've got to boost your yields, right? That's the main differentiation between the kind of low yield agroecological and the conventional stuff. But my God, it can't be today's agriculture. Conventional agriculture. It cannot continue to pollute our waterways. It can't continue to be so wasteful in the way it produces things. So this is a kind of technophiles, the very best of conventional agriculture. Small farm robots, not such big, heavy soil compacting behemoths. It's much more precise use of those synthetic fertilizers that remain. And we need that basically because if you want to eat the level of meat that we currently eat, you've got to have some conventional agriculture to produce those very high yields. I can give you an agroecology only scenario that meets the kind of climate objectives, but you have to eat a heck of a lot less meat. And that's where we as an organization thought that's not a story that we think we can persuade politicians to get on board with, at least not now.
Great, okay, thank you. That was clear. I'm sure there'll be some questions about that, and we'll come on a bit more to that dietary issue, because that's clearly whatever scenarios we're looking at, that's part of the equation. So we'll come on to that discussion, but thank you for that. Katie Jo, let's take the perspective from what does a food and farming system look like from someone who wants to get serious about restoring nature?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I feel you want us to be controversial, but there's so much in what Dustin said that I wholeheartedly agree with. But I suppose one of the most important things from our perspective in the RSPB is that we have to stop being in this situation where we end up being asked to choose and trade off between nature, climate and food. And that is the nature of most of the debate that we get characterized into. Yet actually, the discussions we really need are about what those trade-offs look like and how far we're prepared to go and move, and that level of detail around what ways we can step through that sort of pathway to meet all three objectives is the nature of the debate. And I have to say, just thank you to Soil Association and other colleagues here, because last year we launched the consensus on food farming and nature, which was really about trying to get under the skin of some of those discussions and really involve organisations like the Nature Friendly Farming Network to really understand what this looks like from different perspectives. And I think it has moved us forward. There's loads more work to do, but we really strongly support that, and I think it's really helpful. But we are running out of time, and it feels like we have been having these conversations for quite a long time, and we're not taking our political audiences with us sufficiently. We're not on track to meet net zero from any of the sectors, whether it's energy or agriculture. There's so much to be done, and we have seen from the State of Nature report, which the RSPB is proud to be the coordinating editor body of, that was launched last year, the latest 3-year update, that we have failed to turn the tide. We are still seeing significant loss in our wildlife. And just to give you a few figures from that, that's 1 in 6 species in the UK threatened with extinction. And just to bring it right up to date, in the last 5 years, since we've had the new environmental land management schemes launched, since we were freed from the shackles of Europe, we've seen a further 8% decline in our farmland bird populations. So we are not making progress at anywhere near the pace we need to be making. And, you know, we had the announcements this morning from our ministers. You know, there's some good stuff in there, but it's incremental, where what we need is kind of big shift and transition. So this does come back to the competing pressures we have on a relatively small amount of land and into our traditional asks of land from food and timber production. We are now asking far more from biodiversity because we've got this debt of depletion that we need to build back up. If we're going to restore nature, we really need to be putting a focus on how we can give more land to nature with that as a primary purpose. But as Dustin was saying, we've also want to look at how land can play a much bigger role in storing and capturing carbon. So it does come down to looking for where there are multiple benefits. Single-use land use for food production, or indeed for anything else, is probably not the answer for the majority of our land. So the RSPB did a big piece of work which took quite a number of years to come to fruition. We launched it last autumn, called the Land Use Scenarios Report. And this looked at 7 different scenarios to meet net zero targets. And just to be clear, I refuse to accept any trade-off between whether we're going to meet net zero targets and nature. We have to meet both. This is the biggest threat to our food security in the long term. Both carbon and nature need to be fixed to be in a resilient country. So the Land Use Scenarios Report looked at what meeting nature and climate targets would mean for food. And yeah, this is where it gets tricky, because the best scenarios for carbon and nature are the worst for food production. So you then end up looking at, well, what are the ways you can step through this? And the scenarios really help us with that, because they help us look at, well, what could this mean? So in terms of the benefits, it draws out the land that could be used for what we call nature-based solutions. But really, that's habitat creation and restoration. That's peatlands, wetlands, woodlands, rough pasture, all of the areas that many of them still need to be actively managed. So we will need farmers working those land, but doing different things. So all of those semi-natural habitats have a huge role to play. And at the moment, they don't really feature. They're in the ELM schemes, but they're not really giving a fair reward for the level of work that is required to deliver the carbon and nature benefits on those. But I don't want to let on that nature-based solutions are a kind of silver bullet. They're really not. They are a big part of this, but they're not everything. And I think that's where we have to confront the other options. So ramping up what I would call nature-friendly farming, but the agroecology has to play a big part of it. This is the multiple output land that can deliver for nature and for food. And we know from RSPB's own estate, where we're farming active farms ourselves, and also where we're working with colleagues in the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, that there is lots of benefit to be had from this land for nature as well. So some research we did recently found that 41% of farmers, if they managed only 10% of their land for nature, that would stabilize farmland bird populations. So some of these changes don't need to be huge to have really quite significant impacts as you scale them up. And if we could farm in more agroecology ways, and ramping that up through the ELM schemes could deliver a huge range of benefits as well. And we know as well from some of our estate that we can reduce inputs really quite significantly. We've maintained yields, but also radically reduce the cost because we're not reliant on these inputs being bought in. And then we're also seeing then the biodiversity benefits. So I think we have to then confront the fact that even if you're managing some land for nature and some land in multiple benefit ways for agroecology, you do end up saying, we will produce less food. But when we are throwing away 9 million tonnes of food a year, costing about £19 billion, there's space in there for us to have a better food system that means we don't need to throw away so much food. We need to change the type of food that we're eating, so we have to confront the dietary question. And that means, I would say, less livestock, and less meat, but probably better quality, as other colleagues were saying as well. And it also means the link then into colleagues who work in diet and healthy eating. So there is an opportunity for us to collaborate far more in that area. And I just would like to finish to say that I think one of the big opportunities for us is to connect up people and consumers and customers with this debate, because most people, even RSPB members, are not well connected with understanding where food comes from and what this means for nature. I did a speech very recently where I talked about farmland birds from the off, and someone in the audience, all RSPB members, said, "Farmland birds, do you mean chickens?" And I had to take a real moment of, right, I've started in the wrong place here. So I think we have a big job to do to engage the public on this agenda. And I feel very strongly that we have a role to play in that, but all of us need to participate in that.
Katie Jo, thank you. Not a million miles from where Dustin was, but there are a few differences which we'll explore later. Just a quick question back to you. If I could briefly channel the rewilders, I think they'd come back to you and say, why is the RSPB wasting its time with this stuff? What we need to do is take a whole load of land out of production, produce a load of stuff from vertical farming or industrial farming and the rest of it, and create a load of space for nature that way. What's your response to that?
Well, so rewilding is really about working with natural processes. And I think it's a spectrum of how you do that. We all need to be working far better with nature. It's farming is a subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary of nature. And rewilding is at one end of a spectrum. On the whole, the rewilders tend to have a large amount of land and other assets at their disposal. But that is not the case for the majority of the farmers in the UK. So it's where do you put your energy? I'm very comfortable with the rewilders cracking on and doing what they can do for nature because they've got the land. Fantastic. Many of them are also drawing down a huge amount of agricultural subsidy to bring about that change, I should say as well. But I think the RSPB energy needs to be on helping the majority of farmers make that shift. And I don't think it is a line of saying, there should be no, it's all vertical farming, we should get rid of all of livestock, because so much of our wildlife is dependent on farmed systems. The UK is a relatively small country that has been actively managed and farmed for thousands of years. Most of our wildlife depends on active management. So we really, if we're not going to lose huge swathes of biodiversity, we need to be managing actively the wildlife that we've got, which is keeping the wildlife we've got with us now, and being open and prepared for change, because there will be change with climatic space moving. But I think, it's not a black and white argument, and there's space for us to all take different approaches as long as they're working with the grain of nature.
Great, thank you. Interesting to hear. I'm going to turn next to Adele, I think, because both of our first two speakers have talked about food and diet. So one of the great things about the Oxford Real Farming Conference, it's all about food and farming being seen as the same thing, that they're not separate, and that's clearly coming through. So I'm going to turn to Adele next to perhaps give a little bit more perspective from the food system, and then finally turn to our farmer on the panel, because the final question is, well, what do poor farmers make of all of this? Because there's someone at the middle of this who's got to make a business about making all of this work. So I'm going to come to you last, Helen, if that's all right, to try and make a little bit more sense of that. So Adele, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you for convening this conversation, because although it does feel like we're moving towards somewhat of a consensus, particularly, I guess, compared to 10 or 15 years ago, I do think there's some really fundamental differences still that actually do play out quite in quite a real way with policy. And obviously this is going to be an incredibly important year for policymakers. So I think it's important that we dive into these things that separate us, as well as of course celebrate those things that we all agree on. And I really do agree with a lot of what Dustin and Katie Jo have said. So as you said, Gareth, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means for food production in the UK. And we set about thinking about this question, particularly as a result of the question which has already been asked of, well, yeah, but this is all great, but can we feed ourselves with agroecological food production? And so we wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit. And so first of all, we sort of not defined what we meant by sustainable or agroecological, because there are definitions that exist, and I think more helpfully we should be focusing on the outcomes we all want to achieve. But in terms of principles, what we meant by sustainable agriculture when we started answering this question were three things. Firstly, farming in harmony with nature. So I guess moving away from the rhetoric of farm here and then manage some of your land for nature, really thinking about how we can help farmers produce food which allows nature to thrive across the entire farming landscapes in the middle of the fields as well as around the edges. So farming in harmony with nature. Secondly, obeying the law of return or the circular economy. So really thinking about how we start developing more closed-loop farming systems, less inputs coming in, less waste going out, recycling of nutrients within the farm. And thirdly, sort of linked to the first two, moving towards more biological methods for producing food. Now, we do fundamentally believe that organic farming is where we all ought to be trying to get to, but also believe that that's a bit of a journey that we need to take all farmers on. So as an organization, we aim to work with all farmers and help them move in the direction of biological-based food systems. So based on those three principles, we started to really think about this question. And this was what we came up with, a report called Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, which my brilliant colleagues, Robert Barber, so you can blame him for everything I'm about to say, Bonnie Welch, and led by Patrick Holden, developed a year and a half or so ago now. And I guess actually it's really quite similar to the questions you were answering, Dustin, but I suppose the difference is that this is very much based on the latest research and science that was available. It's also based on what's happening on farms. And you could say anecdotal, intuitive evidence, as well as what's peer-reviewed literature published by Oxford University as well. So we wanted to kind of use the latest science, but also really look at what's happening on the ground, learn from farmers, learn from what they're doing and what they're producing. And so what we did was split up the UK into little squares based on land grade, soil types, topography, culture, and other factors. And then applied the three principles of what we meant by sustainable agriculture across the whole of the UK and thought, okay, what do these farming systems look like? And being crude, it basically meant mixing it all up, moving towards more mixed farming systems across most of the country. So more grasslands and rotations in the arable east, more arable and fruit and veg production, nuts, legumes, etc. in the mostly grassland wests. And of course, there's still some areas of land which cannot, the rough grazing, for example, is the best use of that land. And we actually also increased the area of land which was just for nature. So we increased that percentage up to 10%. So we really tried to mix things up and think about, I suppose, back to the future, how did we used to produce food? And it really was without nitrogen fertilizer, because we took nitrogen fertilizer out of our model for the purpose of this experiment. How can you produce food? How can you recycle nutrients in a truly agroecological mixed farming system? And so there's much more detail on what those farming systems look like across the UK, but broadly mixing it all back up. And so then, of course, the question is, well, how much food would we produce from those farming systems? Because that is, of course, the main critique of agroecological farming systems, as well as potentially the climate impact as well. And we found actually as a nation we could maintain, if not slightly increase, our self-sufficiency with agroecology. There were two main factors, though, that needed to change if that were to be the case. Firstly, we need to waste much less food. Anywhere between 30 and 50% of the food we produce and eat is wasted, so that's entirely ridiculous if we're going to obey the law of return and circular economy. So we need to waste much less food, both at farm level, in processing, and with what we eat. We also do need to change what we eat as well. We can't get away from that. And the biggest conclusion we found in terms of productive capacity of the land around us, if we switch to more agroecological food systems, is that grain production in the UK would roughly halve, because we are moving towards rotations where we're putting grassland back in the system. That means at any one time there's much less land producing grain without nitrogen fertilizer. So that roughly halving of the grain meant that it wouldn't actually really impact how much grain-based stuff we eat as humans, but obviously it massively impacts how much grain-based products animals eat. So as a result, 80% reduction in pork and poultry, which is largely intensively produced here in the UK. So that was the really big conclusion for us. Okay, grain comes down, that doesn't impact how much we eat, but it massively reduces the amount of intensive pork and poultry we eat. Actually, because of the really important role that I don't need to preach to this choir about the really important role of grazing livestock, beef and lamb remained roughly the same, little changes here and there, but remained roughly the same in the UK. We are a grass-based nation, and therefore to maintain fertility in mixed farming systems as well as permanent pasture, we need those livestock still on our land. But of course, we're also saying, mega dairies massively need to come down, but small-scale dairies with animals outside for as much of the year as is possible are also a really important part of our food system. So dairy remains a really important part of our diet with this model. So, it's not. This is not kind of pure science. This is also about intuition and what's really happening. And you'll see in this report, if you have a look at it online, there's quite a lot of farm case studies in there talking about what they produce at what levels. We recognise we need to do more here. We didn't model the climate impact of these systems. Why? Because the report would have been twice as big, but also because there's really not very much data on the climate impact of agroecological farming systems. Like the models we're all thinking about and basing policy on now are largely based on assumption. They're not based on real data. There's probably a handful of farmers who have been keeping long-term soil carbon records because there was no reason to. Like 20 years ago, why would you keep soil carbon records? So what we really need to be doing is incentivizing farmers to collect baseline data holistically across the whole farm. Of course, looking at the climate impact, nature impact, also social, animal welfare, everything. So we have another project called the Global Farm Metric, which is working with many of you in this room to help farmers collect baseline data in a robust, common, and transparent way. And that way, I think we can really start to understand the impact of these systems. I think many of us in this room would intuitively know that agroecology is the right way to go. We do kind of, I guess the key point of difference between ourselves and your report, Dustin, is the bit of land that you suggest should be intensively managed. Because we do feel that we can do this with agroecology. We need more data, totally accept that. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure we'll get into more detail.
Thank you, Adele. That was really interesting, and I do recommend that report. It's a good read and definitely worth looking at, and interesting because in a sense you're looking at the productive capacity. It's a bottom-up approach. So looking at, well, if we're serious about sustainability, what can we produce? And I think it's really interesting from that point of view.
Oh, sorry, I think we need one of these reports in every country in the world because the productive capacity of every country in the world is going to be slightly different. So if we're going to align our diets as citizens of planet Earth in wherever you live, the productive capacity will be slightly different. So, the idea of a kind of notional global diet, I think, is ridiculous.
And just picking up that point on diet, I mean, at the minute, in terms of the political conversation, it's not only that there isn't a conversation about diet, politicians are saying we won't talk about diet. Any thoughts about how we move that shift the dial on that?
Oh, that's a big one. I think we've got to start reconnecting people with the land, and that's not suggesting that everyone in the inner cities should be getting out onto farms every weekend, as much as we'd all, love that to be the case. I just don't think it's viable. But I think transparency is going to be key in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. I think we will hopefully revolutionize the way we buy food by understanding more about the impact of it. And again, that opens a whole load of points about how we do that and what's the right way to go about doing that. But ultimately, let's say in Dreamland, there's a kind of holistic label on, or some sort of communication on all the food we buy, whether it's in the supermarket or in a farmer's market, wherever you buy your food. There's some sort of way of knowing, A, where that, exactly what farm that product or collection of products came from, and B, the impact of it in a holistic way. That's still, it's kind of pointless unless we're educating the general public about why these things are really important, why they should care about not just the climate, but also the nature, also the animal welfare. So I think we need a mass citizen kind of awareness campaign, maybe similar to the sort of comic relief style thing, because that actually had a major impact in increasing government budgets for poverty, which have obviously been backtracked on now. But we've never had anything. We've never had a Live Aid for food. Why not? So I think we should do that.
Okay, maybe we'll pick that up in the questions.
Cool.
Thank you, Adele. Helen, I now turn to the poor farmer who's in the middle of all of this. In a sense, what really matters is are farmers up for this change? What are they to make of these slightly competing narratives, and what prospects do you think there are for change amongst the farming community?
I've been sort of thinking about this as you've been talking about change on farms. And I grew up on a farm in County Tyrone. I grew up on a poultry and beef farm. And it was battery cages in those days, like 40,000 hens in a house. And, and that was the sort of farming that I grew up with. I then left and went to university and got out of farming, and then I married a farmer, and then I'm back on a farm. But the farm that when I came back and was working on my husband's farm, what we were working with there was quite different. It was a very small suckler herd. We were operating in this, the environment, it was never intensive. It was big wild hedgerows and bits of forest and rushy bottoms and, all of those kind of bits around the farm. And we had a feeling, I suppose through all that time that we were farming like that was wrong, that wasn't the way we should be farming, that we should have tidy hedgerows and be cutting and cutting and cutting and yield and, producing in a particular way. And we felt like we weren't doing the right thing. And that certainly, was the way my dad was taught to farm was very different to what we were doing. So I suppose, coming from that quite intensive system onto a much less intensive system, but that wasn't stacking up for us. A small suckler herd on a farm like that just wasn't stacking up financially for us. We both had to have other jobs, which meant we couldn't spend that much time on the farm, which meant we weren't really looking after it the way that we should. So we were in this awful kind of catch-22 of not being able to do it the way we would want to do it, didn't have the money to do it, and we're completely dependent on, the single farm payment coming in was our biggest source of income on the farm. That's just not going to work. So I think there's a whole lot of other farmers in the same boat as us. I suppose the other thing to say about that as well, the other thing that was telling us the whole time that was wrong, that small low intensity farm was wrong, well, apart from not making any money out of it, but also the fact that every year we get our single farm payment map that comes out. I don't know if it works the same way here as it does in Northern Ireland, but every year when we get our map out, there's like all these sections of the farm that have purple hatching through it. Do you have that here? No? You're not familiar? Okay, so you get a nice big map, and there's all these sections that have that are scored out to say you're not getting any money for this bit because it's not productive. So if you've got some gorse or some hedgerows that are coming out into your field and so on, you don't get paid for that bit because that's not productive. So we have been actively encouraged for years and years to do away with all of that habitat and, to really focus on yield. So all of that was telling us that we were not doing it very well. And we were not feeling great about being farmers, I have to tell you. And one of the things that sort of turned that around for us was somebody from Nature Friendly Farming Network, Phil Carson, who was here earlier, coming onto our farm and looking at it and going, actually, do you know what you guys are doing is great. Look, you've got this growing here and that growing there, and there's some of those birds, and there's some of that, and there's some of that. And suddenly we could sort of start to see, not that we didn't notice those things before, but somebody was telling us there's real value in what you're doing. And that was a really, quite transformative thing for us, and somebody not telling us what we were doing was wrong, telling us what we were doing was right. And I think we're a really small farm. I think there's an awful lot of other farms like us who are the ones who would, it's easy for us to change as well. When we're talking about change and transition, we weren't hugely invested in lots of, we didn't have loads of debt, we didn't have loads of machinery to do certain things, we didn't have loads of buildings. So we were the ones who found it, for us, transitioning was really quite easy. So I think there's a whole raft of farms like us who just need somebody to say, yeah, that's, there's other things you can do here. The other thing was we kind of took control of it ourselves. I have to say, if we were waiting for government policy to tell us to do something differently, well, I'm still getting that farm map, and things haven't, whilst there have been some environmental farm schemes and so on that have helped, I'm not getting a clear message necessarily. It was Nature Friendly Farming Network that were giving me that message and saying, yes, it's okay to do things a little bit differently. And we just knew ourselves that we couldn't keep going the way we were going. We couldn't keep not making any money for a start. But we were also, just not very happy with how things were. So we got into, we did a fair little bit of research first, looking at, what type of farming would be more profitable, what type of farming would be more productive, are there things other people aren't trying? To me, it just makes total sense, if we look at sort of farming as an industry, to find a gap, to find a niche, to find something that not everybody else is doing. I think one of the big issues is we all do the same thing. And how do we make money out of that then, because that's the kind of, so much more diversity. And you talked about diversity earlier. Diversity is beneficial in lots of ways because it makes us much more resilient and much more sustainable. So that was kind of what we looked for when we were trying to transition. We said, what could we do that wouldn't be what everybody else is doing? How could we use our land differently? And we got into growing flax on our farm for fibre. That's a whole other story, and there was a workshop earlier. We got into, I also set up a business which was Source Grow, which I mentioned earlier, which is about helping farmers to sort of identify niches in terms of horticulture and growing fruit and vegetables and forage stuff and all of that we sell directly into restaurants. So it's finding those little niches of things that not everybody else is doing and doing it differently. So that allowed us to sort of transition into being able to be much more sustainable, much more diverse, much more resilient, and much less dependent on subsidy. And sorry, I'm straying into the economics of it here, but which I know we're going to talk about later, but I think had we got support to make that transition which we pretty much did mostly ourselves. Had we got support to sort of put infrastructure in to help us with processing flax and those kind of things, that would have been way more beneficial to us than the years of single farm payment that we got.
Thank you, Helen. That's really encouraging, that sense that there's farmers out there who are up for the change. But let me press you a bit on this, the practicalities of this. You're an entrepreneur and you've taken that opportunity. What about the farmer who's invested in a 1,000-cow intensive dairy unit and is in hock to the bank? And what about the chicken farmer in Herefordshire who's been persuaded by Avara to go into intensive chickens and is now hooked into that system? The transition for them is going to be more complicated than what you faced. What's your thinking about how we deal with that one?
Absolutely, it's way more difficult when you're in that sort of situation. It was much easier for us, and I really feel for farmers who are in that position, and it's really not easy at the minute. I think there are systems that work. There are things we can do. There's some really good work that Nature Friendly Farming Network have done around maximum sustainable output and where we can find that point at which, I've got the report here somewhere, where we can find that sort of point at which things will stack up at various scales. We've done lots of case studies on different farms, so I think there are solutions, but we will need support to make that transition. If you're already invested a lot in capital and agriculture, you're going to need some intervention to support with that. But the first thing is offering those, showing that there is a positive way forward. There is a way out of this. There are things that we can do. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of the panellists. I want to come round to questions now because I'm sure that there's lots of things that have cropped up that people would like to interrogate. There's been a fair bit of agreement from the panel, which is fine. Some points of differences too, which it would be great to explore. What I'm going to do, I think, I'm going to take batches of questions, if that's all right, so I can slightly curate the questions so we don't just hop around lots of different topics. So let me take a few questions for starters. I'll take 3, and then we'll answer those and then move on. So. Lots of hands, right, okay. In the front row here.
Okay, I'd like to question a couple of Dustin's slides. Firstly, what about the role of artificial nitrates? They're extremely climate emitting, totally unsustainable, and also disrupt another planetary boundary, being the nitrogen cycle. So we can't have those. And another one is the role of grass-fed meat when it's regeneratively grazed. That can become very carbon capturing with long-term carbon compounds in the soil like glomalin, and actually provide a way of sucking carbon out of the air and provide a huge climate fix. So one has to distinguish between different types of meat.
2 questions there. Can I take a couple more climate-related questions perhaps first? So if you've got a question that's a little bit more linked on the climate side, keep your hand up. Yes, behind, oh, Liz, hello.
Thank you, Gareth. I'm Liz Bowles from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and thank you all the speakers. I think there's a real sort of commonality actually of all your views in terms of we need to be changing our diets, we need to be farming more agroecologically, and yes, we need to be wasting a lot less food. Sorry, brain's not working. I'm thinking about the question I want to ask. So in terms, and I very much like Katie Jo, your comment that we have to actually tackle nature and climate together. And certainly, I suppose my question really is about this climate impact of agroecological farming. I kind of half know the answer because over the last 4 years I was involved in the Fabulous Farmers programme, and they recently produced a report, and they have started to sort of focus on what are the climate impacts of these practices alongside their impacts on nature. So I guess my question is, have you actually got any information that gives us sort of hope that agroecological farming practices are kinder in terms of climate change and climate change mitigation?
Thank Thank you, Liz. And I'll take one more question on a climate theme if there are any remaining. Yes.
Sorry, I've marked a lot of the things that you've been talking about, and if we really want to join forces to shift the narrative for food and farming, we need to be working together, and it seems like there's two different tales of what's happening. There's a sustainable side and the one that still thinks that artificial fertilizers is going to fix everything, and I mean, I was agreeing with what this lady was saying, but like saying that methane is a big source is blaming meat and dairy for all of the methane emissions, whereas you manage to sort of like gloss over the fact that fossil fuels are 10% of the problem, but you're just talking about the fuels that run the tractors and not the artificial fertilizers that are made from fossil fuels. So if we want to stop fossil fuels, we have to stop using artificial fertilizers. There's just no way we can sustainably use them.
Okay, so
just
commonalities with that first point there then. Great, okay, thank you.
And can I sort of go on to
briefly,
this?
yeah.
We need more data in order to prove this side, because that side doesn't seem to understand enough about it. But we haven't got time. And what Satish was saying was first do no harm, is that we need to just stop doing the bad stuff and just do the good stuff. So it means agroecology all the way, and it doesn't matter whether it works or not. We haven't got a choice. We can't carry on using fossil fuels.
So I think the question there is, do we know enough about what's the bad stuff to know what to stop at the moment? So yeah, okay. Right, I'll come first to Dustin, because a lot of that was heading in your direction, I thought, but I'm sure that, others might want to pick it up too.
Yeah, I was advised that talking in favor of artificial fertilizer at the Oxford Real Farming Conference was a career-ending move, but you asked for disagreement. Okay, so yeah, the nitrogen cycle is a serious problem and a massive planetary boundary. Of the nitrogen, the synthetic nitrogen we put on fields, 40% of it washes off straight into the watercourses and destroys any nature in that water. I'm 100% with you on we cannot continue to, absolutely, air pollution as well, you completely agree. One of the differences that came out, I think, really helpfully, and part of the reason why I'm trying to disagree here is so that we disagree well, is in the numbers that Adele presented to you about if you want a zero synthetic inputs, then you've got to have 80% less pork and chicken. That's your modeling. And I think that's kind of reasonable. I wonder whether you actually maybe need to go further if you account for climate on the cattle and lamb side of things. But that's a good disagreement to have. We can have that in numbers, and we should kind of pull that out. The reason why we have some conventional agriculture in there is because I don't think I can persuade a politician to sign up to a scenario that gets to 80% less chicken. I mean, I defy you to find a politician who will say, people of Britain, eat 80% less chicken. No bacon sandwiches for you, Mr. Builder. That's the kind of challenge. I defy you to find a politician that says, I'm going to put up the price of your chicken. But the point is there's a good argument to be had here. It's a judgment, though, and we're on different sides of a judgment. That's a good disagreement to have. I don't think I can persuade a politician. You think you do? Brilliant. Let's have at it and see whether you can. On the evidence on grass-fed meat, this is an area where the evidence is really complex and frustrating, and we actually do need more fundamental research. So I've read loads of data from the United States about the ability of using ruminants to grow essentially deeper root stocks in soil, which sequesters carbon. There are some really interesting stuff going on there, but the context is these American soils have been thrashed to death by 100 years of super intensive agriculture. So they start from not as bad. Britain has not gone to the same place that the Midwest has gone in terms of destroying our soils. We clearly need to have a conversation afterwards. I'm very happy to do so. But looking at the evidence base, American soils have got absolutely thrashed, and therefore you can stick a lot more carbon back in them in a way that it doesn't look to me, looking at the evidence, like we can. But the point that we haven't done is to have really robust agroecological research on how can agroecology sequester more carbon than soils? How much can we do? And that's where I think we do need to fund some public research to answer some of these questions, so we can figure out, yeah, exactly how can you have a carbon neutral beef farm run agroecologically? Maybe you can. As far as I can tell, the evidence isn't yet there, and we desperately need to get that evidence. Do you want me to touch on any of the others? Or? Okay, so on artificial fertilizer, I think there's a world in which let's chat afterwards. There's a world in which you can make artificial nitrogen without using fossil fuels. You need to make hydrogen, it's a bit complicated, it probably makes the artificial nitrogen fertilizer more expensive, but let me tell you, there is a whole universe of chemists and big agriculture companies that are pushing in this direction. You might not like it, you might think this is a bad thing to do, but they're gonna do it. And if they're gonna do it, then the question is, are farmers going to say, we've got this resource? I've spoken to plenty of agroecological farmers who are on the kind of boundary of like, maybe a bit of nitrogen, up my yields a bit, not too much, nothing like the rates that are applied conventionally. That's going to be a market where I think people are going to play. And so the question for me is, how do we get the use of that nitrogen fertilizer in a way that doesn't destroy the natural environment? And I think there is a space for it, but we can agree to disagree.
Just check if any of the other panelists want to pick up on the climate nitrogen point before we move on to other topics. Katie Jo?
Yeah, very briefly. So I don't think we know, in answer to the question, that we do need to do more work on it. The RSPB is doing this on some of our estates. So we've got Hope Farm in Cambridgeshire, where we've got a carbon farming project looking at exactly the question you've answered, but we won't get quick answers from any of this. I did also just want to say that one of the real challenges is that lots of other sectors need to offset emissions that they cannot abate through reductions, and they are all looking at the land sector. So the land sector cannot sit back and just think it's got its own land to worry about here. Everyone else is looking at abating their non-offsettable and non-reducible emissions on your land. So I just think that's really important, because what will happen very quickly is we'll get into debates about, you know, less grain, more into carbon, great, but where are we going to feed all those chickens from unless we change the diets? Because otherwise it'll all come from soy imported, which we know where that's coming from in lots of cases from important tropical forests. So.
Yeah, just super quickly, just on the grazing livestock point, because I think we could speak about that this whole time, but we have a session tomorrow at 9 o'clock which pulls together all the latest evidence on grazing livestock. But I think the point was made about the polluter pays principle and political suicide with chickens, and you know, which I do kind of agree with right now, especially in this cost of living crisis. I think the key is finding ways to reward the carrots, as well as like slowly increasing the regulatory baseline with the sticks. I think if we only tell politicians to introduce sticks, they'll never do it. But I think thinking, you know, that narrative of how do we reward the right stuff, which is broadly what the public money for public goods model is trying to do, but just not doing it. I think that's the way we can shift the balance of financial advantage away from intensively produced food, whether it's plants or animals, towards the agroecological alternatives. So the introduction of true cost accounting, I think, will be a game changer. To do that, we need common, robust data. I agree, we don't have time. We really need to do this ASAP.
Great, thanks. I'm going to collect another 3 questions right at the back over there. And then Soz here.
So I think one of the biggest tools in the farmer's toolbox in terms of managing land and livestock is the power of rest on farm, and moving away from a set stocking system, i.e. sort of continuous grazing throughout the year on weeks of months on end, and move into a more rotational and mob grazing approach, because that means bigger roots, bigger plants, and the evidence suggests or shows that you can increase yield significantly by doing that transition. And just a note on the fertilizer, I guess one of the reasons we're using lots of fertilizer at the moment is because the industry really likes ryegrass, and ryegrass thrives and only sort of gets into the game compared to multi-species swaths by the application of nitrogen. So it was interesting to see, yeah, when it comes to agroecology, where does the principle of rest comes in? Because it's one of the main principles of regenerative farming, and I guess the modelling that's taken place is based on sort of, you know, the current trends in farming, which is sort of 99% set stocked, I guess. So if we were all to move from that set stocking system into a more sort of rotational mob grazing system, what does that mean for the future land use narrative? because it's a win-win, I think, for climate, nature, and food as well.
I might come to Helen on that in a moment, but take a question here from the front. You'll need a microphone.
Thank you very much. Christopher Stopes. I'm Policy Advisor for Organic Farmers and Growers and the co-chair of the English Organic Forum. And there isn't enough time to ask my comprehensive question, which is why aren't the panellists saying organic's a good idea? I'm going to ask it anyway. But it's more that I've heard the claim we don't have data from agroecological farms. We have heaps of data from organic farms. We don't have anyone doing it. We do, and more so in Europe. So what we need to have is the advocacy from Green Alliance. So in your excellent report from this time last year, you mentioned that 3% of British farmland is agroecological. When I asked Lydia what was the source of that, she said, well, it's organic farming. I said, why didn't you put that in? If you don't say organic is a good idea, we're not going to make headway. We are making headway in other European countries, 25% upwards of.
So your question is, are you prepared to talk about organic, basically?
I'm prepared. Yeah, this is a simple question. I'd put it to Katie Jo. I'd put it to Adele as well.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for that. And hand back your mic. A question over on this side here. Back, Ben, can you, okay.
Thank you. Ben Reynolds from the UK branch of the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Two linked short questions, primarily for Dustin, but I'd be really interested in the other panelists' views on this. Of the 4 nations farm policies and funding schemes, which would best deliver on for example, the Green Alliance vision? And what role could the forthcoming land use strategy do to achieve this? How could it work in tandem with that farm policy?
Thanks for that question. Right, Helen, let's come to you first, perhaps on the first question that we had here.
Sorry, remind me.
Which was about the resting of the land and livestock systems.
Reese. Yeah, well, I'm going. Reese is also Nature Friendly Farming Network, so I'm going to automatically agree with everything that he just said. No, it makes total sense to, those kind of rotational systems, putting less pressure on the land, leaving more space for nature. You're kind of we're already there in that. Preaching to the converted with that one, I think.
And this other question about the O word, should we be actually talking about organic systems as exemplars here? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, you'd mentioned at the start about I'd written it down, looks like organic, but not called organic, which I think might be where I'm at. And yeah, I mean, I've had good conversations at the conference here about organic conversion and looking at that as an option. So, I mean, I'm personally, as a farmer, very keen to go down that route and find out more about that. I think there's a lot of other people who will be interested too. The barriers, I think, have just been around, just a perception about it in terms of, paperwork and money and those kind of things, and that's something we need to tackle,
And I'm going to ask you that this beauty contest between the 4 parts of the UK, started with Northern Ireland. How do you think the 4 domains are shaping up for this?
In terms of agricultural policy, future agricultural policy. I mean, we're, I think, a little bit behind. Obviously we're in a situation at the minute where we have no government. They're not sitting. So whilst policy discussions are still going on, and we're trying to, get those conversations, we're trying to input as much as we can.
Meantime,
I think
you're still getting your map with saying you can't have your subsidy here because it's purple hatched. Right.
That's the situation at the minute. And to be honest, I mean, I think we can't wait for it. On the ground, we've got to get on with it. And I think, I come from quite an entrepreneurial background. I work in, entrepreneurship and innovation and those kind of things. And, I think that's where a lot of it needs to come from as well. When we look at, Belfast has been absolutely transformed in the last 10 or 20 years by, a real upsurge in interesting, innovative businesses, and that there's a real cultural shift, and that's not come, that's come about through people doing cool stuff and you know, med tech and fintech and all of those kind of things. And I think we need to adopt that kind of approach. We need to have a much more innovative culture in agriculture, and I'm keen to look at how can we create that sort of space where people are feeling good about trying new things and taking little risks and looking for new crops and doing all of those kind of really exciting things, and how can we support that kind of innovation within agriculture, which we've already seen within the sort of business sector. And a lot of that actually is about, you know, being quite open source about it and say, you know, when we're developing a new technology, sharing that out. When we learn new things, sharing that out. So I think we need to adopt a lot more of that kind of approach.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to pick up any of the points? Katie Jo.
Thank you. So, Therese, I very much agree with you. I mean, I think this idea of kind of mob grazing, mixed grazing, all of those things, we know from 40 plus years of agro-environment schemes just how important supporting mixed farming is, and yet we're not putting all of that into practice at the moment. One of my big frustrations, which Helen illustrated beautifully actually, is the importance of advisors in agro-environment schemes. None of our 4 countries have got sufficient advisory models being developed, and we know exactly just how important that person-to-person contact is around what is valued, what is understood, that is relevant to that individual farmer's system, that is really critical. So I would rate all 4 farming schemes so far in all the countries as deeply inadequate. I think the Welsh scheme looks promising, but there doesn't seem to be enough funding coming through for the right prescriptions. I think the English scheme looked really good when it was announced in 2018, but all the energy and focus has evaporated from that, and now we've got these kind of depleted schemes that don't seem to have anywhere near the right focus on the higher level and the high value delivery at all. I just also wanted to say, I think there's a really important thing. The mindset of farming has been shifted to be about production and output at all costs, whereas actually what we need to do with agroecology is to have the numbers of stock and the types of stock, whether that's the breeds, to fit the natural conditions of the land. And that's a really fundamental shift in the mindset. And that means that actually you can still farm and make space for nature if you adopt that mindset. And I'm going to be a little bit naughty and have a little plug for the work that RSPB has been doing around Fair to Nature, which is the only certification scheme that now exists in the UK, which is focused on nature. So I think organic farming and soil association accreditations are all really important, but we don't have a habitat-focused measure. And I would love to see something like Fair to Nature adopted by the organic movement, because that would bring in a much better look on habitat quality as well. So.
Two questions over there, and then I'd like to take a couple of questions from our online audience as well, if that's possible. So, yes, in the front row there.
Yeah, so I've really enjoyed it so far, and the reason I came was because I'm really interested in the idea of coalition, particularly in my research. But what struck me from the start is the absence of the part of the movement that focuses on the more social and political aspects of agroecology as the food sovereignty movement. And I think that has actually shown up quite a lot and been an absence in the conversation. And so I guess like a question around that is like, how do we bring in those questions of power within the food system? And it particularly struck me around the alternative protein conversation, like where is that alternative protein coming from? What are the threats in terms of the dominance of big corporations in that? And when a lot of the speakers are talking about the need to reduce food waste and change diets, those are like fundamentally very social and political questions, and you can't take power out of those things. So I guess I'm quite interested from the different speakers around thinking about what are the potential opportunities and barriers of those coalitions that also consider power and perhaps some of the tensions between different parts of the movement and how we find that commonality still.
So Helen, I heard you say that it was a process to find a niche, and the hard thing is everyone is doing the same thing. So if there's a very saturated market for small-scale diversified agriculture, but we're trying to meet consumer demand with this agroecological model. I'm curious what is happening in like market innovation and how farmers are collaborating to get their small scale products to this larger base.
Okay, we'll take, there's two contrasting questions there. Can we take a couple of online questions, perhaps?
Sure. There's 120 people joining us online, and I think your objective to create controversy has been achieved. So I'll start with the sticky questions first, if that's okay. There's a lot about meat, not surprising here. So going back to the point of intensively farmed pork and chicken, so a question from Christine Hugh-Jones online. Starting with a statement, the price of intensively farmed pork and chicken should include environmental costs. It must be more expensive. Bill Grayson adding, if we can't get politicians to back policies that allow bad products to be priced out of the market, we are stumped. So I think the question here is there a way where we can achieve that, where we can convince politicians to price these intensively farmed meats correctly? And if there's space for another question, I think that's the crux of why we're here. From Bill Grayson, do we need a food system based on land sparing, i.e. sustainable intensification, or land sharing, agroecology, nature-friendly farming, to deliver on all of society's needs? And that includes healthy food.
Right, what a rich selection of questions. I'm going to start with Adele, maybe on the meat issue, and how do we navigate through this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, to answer the last question, just very briefly, land sharing. And then to the meat issue, it goes back to the point of unpriced externalities, and kind of to the point about the kind of social issues behind this. At the moment, our food system disempowers both farmers and citizens, and we need to figure out how we shift that on its head. And I do fundamentally believe it's probably going to come from sort of pressures maybe from international governments. I think when you go to events like COP, for example, amongst the chaos, there is this little competition going on between companies and countries, is what I meant to say, where, for example, the 4 per 1,000 soil scheme that was announced at COP21, it never kind of fully got introduced, but it did mean that other governments came on board and thought, oh God, we're being left behind on soil carbon policies, what do we do about it? And I think the same will be true for true cost accounting. I think it will be pressure put on by other governments to do this. So it's kind of thinking beyond just our national borders a little bit, because of course, our food system is as much governed by food that comes in from elsewhere. So I think pricing externalities is the key to doing this, but it will be really hard.
Dustin, I want to bring you in on this one if I can.
On the meat and power question. So you will be pleased to hear we have written a report recently on this subject where we outline sort of 4 worldviews within the food system and think about the kind of alliances that might be built between these 4 worldviews. Very, very briefly, we see that there are traditionalists who are mostly farmers who think that, basically carrying on doing things the way they are is broadly okay. It's a grand, long-standing tradition. Agroecologists, I think most people in this crowd would feel part of that fraternity, whether on the pure organic front or something a little bit less well-defined. Sustainable intensifiers, we had a question about that. Do we just want a land spare? There's a whole fraternity, probably over the road, who would say let's go hard for yield and then make some space for nature off the farm. And then the final group are what we call techno-vegans. So you might think of George Monbiot as a techno-vegan, but people who are basically saying let's use alternative proteins to create food without relying on farming. And at the moment, we think that there's this weird kind of alliance forming between sustainable intensifiers and traditionalists to basically keep the system looking the same. And that's really bad for agroecology. And I think alternative proteins people, techno-vegans, are sort of raging against that. The best alliance, we think, is an alliance between agroecologists and techno-vegans, which will probably cause you all to go, hang on a second, the hair on the back of my neck is flipping out, because these two worldviews disagree so radically on political power, on food sovereignty, on economics, but there is a happy marriage there somewhere. Maybe not marriage, alliance, because marriage implies love, and I think there's not going to be love there, which is that techno-vegans are saying, look, we can give you really radical meat reduction without having to persuade the archetypal politician that you need to eat 70 or 80% less meat. And agroecologists can say, hey, we can give you a mixed, diverse system that doesn't end up in the kind of caricature of pure land sparing that, at least in Europe, people kind of reject. So I think there's a real opportunity in driving that kind of alliance. On the land sparing versus land sharing question, just briefly, both. It's a both and story. We need both space just for nature and nature on farms. If we do either one or the other, then we end up with a climate problem or a nature problem, or both.
Thank you. Great. Helen.
I just wanted to respond to your question over there about finding your niche as a farmer and what we can do together. And I think the key to identifying those things is to massively sort of, first of all, shorten the supply chains as much as we can, so that the more we are getting stuff from a farm directly onto people's plates or onto people's backs, if we're talking textiles and clothes, the more opportunity we have to sort of find something that works for us at a kind of quite localized level. So and to make it stack up for us. One of the things we're doing with Source Grow is about sort of identifying how many more things could we grow on our farms that suit our climate, that suit our soil, that people locally are currently buying from other places. So, there's just a massive gap there for us to fill, and it's an obvious thing, I think, for a lot of us to step into those types of farming to fill that gap, to provide that local supply of a much wider diversity of crops. We grow, really good produce in Northern Ireland. We grow great, leeks and onions and turnips and potatoes, and we're really well known for that. But there's loads of other stuff we could be growing as well. Loads of other stuff.
Great, thank you. Is there a clever, quick online question that we can pose to the panelists for a wrap-up? Thought I'd put you on the spot there.
There is one. I'm not sure if it's quick. Guess what? It's about meat again. And I think it's with less meat being a proposed solution, there's a danger that it will be replaced by oils, like palm oil, that have a detrimental impact on nature and health. So what is the solution to this?
It's quite a complex one. Does anyone, Dustin, do you want to have a quick crack at that, and while the others are having a think?
Yeah, this is a long conversation. Just very briefly, I think in a sense, all the analysis we've done says, tell me how much meat you want to eat, and I will tell you how intensively you have to farm. There's a direct relationship between the two. If you are happy to have less meat, you can farm less intensively and get all the benefits of doing that. On the oil crops particularly, we consume way too much fat in Western societies, whether from palm oil or from beef, or choose your fat of choice. We consume too much from a health perspective. So I'm pretty confident that if we're choosing a diet that is good for us and good for the planet, we don't necessarily need to have that problem of going out of, say, milk fat, dairy fat, and into palm oil. Great. But it's quite a tricky one.
Thank you. Adele, 20 seconds, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, the fats issue is so interesting because effectively we are living off the fat of the Bornean rainforest or wherever it may be, rather than the fat of our own land at the moment. And I think the key is how do we live off the fat of our own land, brackets, within the carrying capacity and planetary boundaries of the land around us. So yeah, fats are incredibly important, but why are we burning our animal fats around the back of abattoirs right now? It's kind of crazy.
Final reflections. Okay, thanks for being friendly. And yeah, I suppose just to say, I think from a farming point of view, we we are good with the pace of change. Farming did change very rapidly between my mother-in-law's time and when we took the farm over. It changed very rapidly. So I think farming is capable of change.
Thank you. And Katie Jo.
Well, I was just going to end on the point that the lady over there made around how we collaborate and coalitions. So I think one of the things that's really struck me, having been here fresh from my hot Christmas leave, is just the importance of the dialogue across different sectors. And it is one of the ways we get picked off, I think, is because we tend to talk in our silos. I would never pretend to talk on a topic that I don't know very much about in the sort of food justice world, but it's really important that we are speaking to each other and collaborating more, because I think the more we can present this and help people understand the systemic nature of the change we need in our food systems and how the different aspects are impacting right across the environment, people's health, and the governance systems as well as farming systems, then we are much more able to have shared impact, even if we don't have knowledge across all of those areas. So one for consensus and collaboration.
And thank you to the audience here and also to our online audience for a good, respectful debate. I think it's great to have a chance to air some of these things and look at some of the difficult, knotty areas that we've got to keep tackling. So let's see if we can keep some of those conversations going. Thank you also to our technical support here and also to the volunteers who've helped us run a really effective session. And particularly thank you to the panelists next to me for joining in this debate. Thank you very much for your contributions, and I hope you've all enjoyed the show here tonight. Thank you.